A raw bar oyster looks luxurious, but Americans once bought oysters as cheap street food. That change began beneath the water, long before the oyster reached a menu. In 19th-century cities, oysters filled basement cellars, crowded saloons, market stalls, and inexpensive stews. Laborers ate them, so did travelers, merchants, and wealthy diners. The food, now arranged shell by shell on crushed ice, once came with beer, bread, and whatever else could turn a quick bite into a filling meal. Oysters did not go from common food to delicacy because the animal somehow became more refined. Everything around it changed. Living reefs created extraordinary abundance along the coast. Urban markets learned to extract and distribute that abundance on an industrial scale. Then harvesting damaged the reefs. Growing cities polluted the water, and disease and regulation narrowed the supply. Restaurants eventually turned what remained into a carefully staged experience centered on freshness, origin, and rarity. How did one shellfish belong to both worlds? The answer lies outside the dining room and below the surface, where oysters once built the structures that made them cheap. An oyster reef is more than a muddy bottom scattered with oysters. It is a structure built by generations of oysters growing on the shells of earlier generations. Adults release eggs and sperm into the water. After fertilization, the young begin life as tiny swimming larvae. Eventually, each one needs to settle on something hard. An old oyster shell works especially well. It raises the new animal above soft sediment and places it near other oysters that can reproduce. One oyster attaches to another. More gather around them. The dead shells stay where they are, and living oysters add layer after layer. Given enough time, the reef rises into the water as a dense, irregular mass of shell and life. That extra height makes a difference. Moving water reaches a raised reef, bringing food and oxygen. Oysters there can escape some of the sediment that would smother animals lying flat on the bottom. The reef's crevices shelter crabs, worms, small fish, and other organisms as well. Oysters do not merely occupy a habitat, they build one. The result is a powerful cycle. Old shells give young oysters somewhere to settle. Those young oysters extend the reef. The larger reef then provides more surface for the next generation. With suitable water, enough adults, and time, the system produces more of its own abundance. Human communities along North America's Atlantic and Gulf coasts valued that abundance long before European colonization. Archaeologists have found shell middens containing oysters and the remains of other meals accumulated over thousands of years. Some deposits are modest, others stretch through extensive layers, recording repeated harvests across many generations. They are physical evidence of a relationship between coastal peoples and oyster grounds that was already ancient by the time European ships arrived. That history cannot be reduced to a single image of untouched nature. Indigenous communities differed, and their harvesting practices changed across regions and periods. People chose gathering places, returned with the seasons, discarded shells, and altered coastal environments through use. Some harvests may have been intensive. Others were limited by population, tools, custom, access, or the natural cycles of particular estuaries. The crucial difference lay between gathering oysters from a reef and dismantling the conditions that let the reef renew itself. In many places, people harvested within systems that kept producing shell, larvae, and habitat. The reef endured. The oysters returned. That gives us the first answer to the mystery of cheap oysters. They cost little where living coastal structures had spent generations accumulating them. Nature was not making isolated delicacies one by one. It was sustaining dense biological neighborhoods, with each generation fixed to the remains of the one before it. European settlers found these productive waters beside places that would become major centers of American commerce. The shores around New York and Long Island, Delaware Bay, and the Chesapeake held extensive oyster grounds, though local conditions varied. Early descriptions, harbor observations, archaeological remains, and later fishery records all point to the same broad conclusion. Oysters were regionally abundant on a scale that became hard to imagine after centuries of alteration. In shallow water, harvesters could use hand tongs, long tools like enormous rakes joined together as scissors. Working from a small boat, a tonger lowered the jaws to the bottom, closed them around clusters of oysters, and hauled the catch aboard. It took strength and an intimate knowledge of the bed. At first, though, it required no factory, elaborate vessel, or rare skill held by only a few people. Distance helped determine price. Coastal towns stood close to beds dense enough to yield large catches. Oysters could reach them alive and still in their shells. There was no slaughterhouse, and little preparation was needed before sale. With a knife, some heat, and a pot, they became a meal. People ate them raw, but that was just one option. Oysters were roasted over fire, fried, stewed with milk or broth, baked into pies, pickled for storage, and mixed with other ingredients for protein and substance. Modern raw bar etiquette can make an oyster seem incomplete without a special fork and a conversation about mineral notes. Earlier Americans put oysters into nearly anything that could hold them. Their abundance did not confine them to poor tables. Wealthy households and formal dining rooms served oysters too. Cookbooks offered elaborate preparations, and the right presentation could make them a sign of hospitality or refinement. The same ingredient appeared in both fashionable meals and plain tavern stews. That wide range matters. Oysters were not merely a despised food that rich people eventually discovered. They were not permanently precious either, with one brief cheap period. They crossed class lines because the supply was large enough to support several markets at the same time. Cooks could handle them delicately, while vendors sold them by the bowl to customers who needed a quick and affordable meal. Local abundance created that culture. Better transport spread it. As American towns became cities, canals, coastal shipping, steam power, ice, and railroads pushed oyster markets farther from the beds. The oyster remained tied to the water, but customers no longer had to eat it within sight of the boat that brought it ashore. In New York, oysters traveled from reef to customer through a restless waterfront economy. Harvesting boats and market vessels carried them to the city. Docks and wholesale dealers moved them onward, and eating houses scattered them across New York. Some oysters stayed in their shells until a customer ordered them. Workers shucked others for stews, frying, or shipment. Oyster cellars became one of the city's most recognizable institutions. The name was often quite literal. Many occupied basement rooms below the street, where customers left the city noise for counters, tables, steam, piles of shell, and the smell of hot broth. Yet, oyster cellar described very different businesses. Some were rough, inexpensive rooms for workers and late-night crowds. Others had polished service, private dining spaces, and carefully prepared dishes. Oysters fit comfortably into all of them. Customers ordered them raw, roasted, fried, or simmered into stew. Saloons served oysters because they were filling and went naturally with drink. Street sellers and market stalls brought them directly into the paths of workers who lacked the time or money for a formal meal. Travelers found oysters near transport hubs and entertainment districts. Nightlife kept the market going long after ordinary dining hours. Period advertisements, menus, directories, and descriptions repeatedly place oysters throughout this urban world. Later retellings give wildly different estimates of how many oysters New Yorkers consumed each day, and the grandest totals deserve caution. We do not need them to see the larger pattern. Oyster businesses were plentiful, they took many forms, and their customers came from every level of the city. Immense supply made those social boundaries unusually porous. Oysters appeared in elegant dining rooms and in establishments where a tablecloth was apparently an unnecessary luxury. The room, recipe, and service gave them meaning more than rarity did. No career captures that flexibility better than Thomas Downing's. Born free on Virginia's eastern shore, Downing grew up in a coastal region where knowledge of oyster waters carried economic value. He later moved to New York. In 1825, he opened an oyster cellar on Broad Street in Lower Manhattan. That address put him near the city's commercial heart. Offices, merchants, brokers, and the growing machinery of American finance worked above him. Below street level, Downing built a dining business around a shellfish abundant enough to seem ordinary and versatile enough to become elegant. His establishment earned a distinguished reputation. Contemporary accounts and later historical research describe prosperous merchants, public officials, and visitors among its customers. Downing stressed quality and service. He turned inexpensive raw material into a refined restaurant experience without acting as though oysters belonged exclusively to the rich. The contrast is almost architectural. His dining room sat beneath Broad Street while drawing customers from the upper ranks of New York society. Elsewhere in the same city, oysters remained within reach at stalls, saloons, and humbler cellars. Downing's success is also part of the history of black enterprise in a city where racial discrimination sharply limited opportunity. He became prominent as both a restaurateur and an abolitionist who advocated for civil rights. His business helped finance political work and placed a free black entrepreneur in the center of a commercial district whose institutions often excluded people like him. Later accounts connect Downing's cellar with dramatic Underground Railroad stories and long lists of famous guests. The documentation behind those details is uneven, so they cannot all be treated as certain. The surviving record is impressive, without embellishment. Downing built a celebrated oyster business, gained influence, and used his position to support abolition and black civic life. His restaurant shows what oyster abundance made possible. An inexpensive ingredient does not have to produce an inexpensive culture. With a broad underlying supply, one food can sustain street sellers, wage workers, specialists, and luxury service at once. Accessibility and refinement can share the same city. Downing's cellar, however, needed a reliable flow of oysters from productive waters. As cities grew, that demand encouraged a much larger system. A regional trade became an industrial network. The Chesapeake Bay grew into one of that network's great centers. Its estuaries held vast oyster grounds, while Baltimore became a major hub for shucking, packing, preserving, and shipping the catch. Boats delivered oysters into crowded processing houses. There, workers opened shells rapidly and prepared the meat for several different markets. Canning weakened one of the trade's oldest constraints. A live oyster in its shell could travel only so far when conditions were unreliable. Seal the processed oyster inside a can, and it could reach consumers living nowhere near a tidal estuary. Ice and improved cold storage carried the fresh trade farther. Steam vessels moved oysters across water more quickly. Rail cars linked coastal packing centers with distant cities. The distance narrowed. The market widened. Oysters became a national product. Their low price was now partly an industrial accomplishment. It depended on harvesting crews, shuckers, packers, barrels, cans, icehouses, docks, locomotives, and wholesalers. It also depended on work that was often exhausting and poorly paid. Black workers, immigrants, women, and children all took part in sections of the harvesting and packing economy, with their roles changing by place and period. Every cheap oyster on a city counter carried a great deal of human labor in its price. That industrial reach put more pressure on the reefs. Crews continued using hand tongs, but dredging let them scrape wider stretches of bottom and collect more oysters. Dredges could raise the catch dramatically. They could also break reef structure apart, scatter shell, and disturb the elevated surfaces where young oysters had the best chance of surviving. From the deck of a harvesting vessel, the distinction was easy to miss. An industry counting landings could see the reef as inventory sitting on the bottom. Biologically, it was more like a factory that manufactured its product and its own floor. Taking oysters removed one part of the system. Flattening or removing the shell structure also weakened the reef's ability to produce another generation. Competition grew so intense that Maryland and Virginia established laws, restrictions, and enforcement systems for their oyster grounds. Disputes about dredging, access, licenses, and boundaries led to confrontations remembered collectively as the Chesapeake Oyster Wars. That name sounds like one continuous conflict. In reality, it describes a succession of enforcement struggles and violent incidents over time. Government vessels patrolled the water, enforced oyster laws, and confronted illegal harvesters. An appetizer now required an armed regulatory presence. The absurdity stops there. Those patrol boats showed how severe the pressure had become. Too many people had discovered how much money could be pulled from the same finite grounds. Industrialization extended the market and lowered prices for consumers. It also sped up extraction. The system looked successful because it moved extraordinary quantities of oysters. Its preferred measure was what came out of the water, not whether the reef below could rebuild itself. Once you understand how a reef works, its vulnerability is obvious. Oyster larvae need hard surfaces, particularly clean shell, where they can settle. Dredging can lower the reef and damage its shell base. Repeated harvests remove adults that would otherwise reproduce. Sediment can bury the surfaces that remain. Once flattened and depleted, a reef catches fewer larvae, shelters less life, and may stay in poor condition even after harvesting declines. No single force caused the decline everywhere. Overharvesting dominated early in some waters. Elsewhere, shoreline change, sediment, disease, altered salinity, or pollution added to the damage. Around industrial cities, however, extraction and waste often arrived side by side. Growing urban populations emptied sewage into rivers, bays, and harbors. Factories contributed other contamination. Oysters eat by drawing water across their gills and collecting suspended particles. That feeding method suits productive estuaries. It also lets oysters concentrate microorganisms found in polluted water. Their close biological connection to the surrounding water now made them a public health risk. An oyster could look perfectly normal while carrying pathogens that came from human sewage. Eating it raw removed the protection that thorough cooking might offer. By the early 20th century, authorities were closing or restricting beds around heavily urbanized waters because pollution had made harvesting unsafe or unacceptable. New York Harbor had once stood at the center of the city's oyster identity. It lost much of that commercial role through degraded habitat, contaminated water, altered shorelines, and earlier extraction. New York had built an oyster culture while damaging the waters that kept it alive. A major crisis followed in 1924 and 1925, when contaminated oysters were linked to a serious typhoid outbreak. Public health investigations traced illnesses across state lines to oysters harvested from polluted waters and distributed through an expanding commercial network. The outbreak hastened stronger sanitation controls, inspections, certification, and cooperation among the authorities responsible for shellfish safety. Those controls answered a real danger. They were not pointless barriers between customers and affordable food. Approved growing waters, sanitary handling, refrigeration, and traceable distribution made oysters safer to sell. Safety also changed the economics and geography of the business. Informal access diminished. Producers and dealers now had to satisfy standards requiring oversight, infrastructure, and dependable cold handling. Beds closed. Supply chains became tighter. The old street trade shrank. Farther south, Chesapeake oysters still carried the accumulated pressure of the earlier trade. Habitat loss and heavy harvesting had already weakened many reefs.
During the 20th century, the oyster diseases called MSX and dermo added severe biological stress. Their effects differed according to location, temperature, salinity, oyster condition, and time. Disease did not simply replace earlier explanations for the decline. It hit populations already living in heavily altered systems and made their recovery harder. The causes need to stay in their proper order and setting. Dredges could destroy reef structure. Harvesting could reduce breeding populations. Sewage could close urban beds and pass disease to consumers. Oyster pathogens could devastate surviving populations elsewhere. Regulation could protect public health while increasing the demands placed on anyone entering the market. Combined, these forces broke apart the easy abundance that cheap urban oysters had required. Industrial cities did more than consume enormous numbers of them. They changed the beds, shorelines, and water. They ate the product while degrading the biological machinery that produced it. Ecological scarcity still does not fully explain how oysters became a modern luxury. If depletion automatically created prestige, every scarce food would appear on ice beside a printed biography of its birthplace. Restaurants finished the transformation that environmental decline had begun. As oyster cellars and informal street sales disappeared, oysters stayed in businesses capable of absorbing the costs of regulated sourcing, refrigeration, perishable stock, and skilled shucking. Opening an oyster cleanly, without losing its liquor or leaving shell fragments, takes practice. Keeping live shellfish safe requires close temperature control. A restaurant also risks losing any inventory that remains unsold as its quality falls. Modern raw bars turned those limitations into part of the presentation. Oysters are often arranged one by one, identified by growing region, and served so that differences in shell, size, salinity, sweetness, texture, and finish become part of the meal. Place can genuinely change flavor. Water conditions, available food, oyster species, growing method, season, and handling all shape what arrives on the plate. Prestige language then gathers around those genuine differences. Some menus describe an oyster as though it owns both a coastal address and a modest aristocratic title. The performance can be theatrical, the variation beneath it is real. Today's price contains several layers. First comes the oyster, then cultivation or regulated harvest, sorting, transport, refrigeration, loss, labor, service, and the restaurant itself. Scarcity provides the physical basis. Dining culture gives that scarcity the familiar appearance of luxury. None of this means every oyster is unaffordable, or that all modern oysters come from collapsing wild reefs. Near producing regions, they can still be relatively inexpensive. Prices vary greatly among farms, markets, casual restaurants, and expensive raw bars. Aquaculture has expanded the supply as well, raising oysters under managed conditions. Farmed oysters begin with the controlled production or collection of young animals. Growers place them in suitable coastal waters using bags, cages, racks, beds, and other systems. The methods differ. These oysters still draw their food from the surrounding water, and local growing conditions still shape them. Aquaculture can ease pressure on some wild fisheries and offer a more predictable commercial crop. An oyster farm, however, is not automatically the equivalent of an ancient reef. Farms are arranged to produce oysters for market. A restored reef may exist mainly to rebuild habitat and reproduce without being harvested. A sanctuary reef may prohibit removal altogether. A public harvesting area serves a different purpose again. The systems can help one another, but they do not have identical goals. Keeping that distinction clear saves the story from an easy verdict. Modern regulation does more than increase the price of oysters. It helps raw shellfish reach large markets under greater oversight. Aquaculture cannot reproduce every ecological role of a lost reef, but it can provide oysters, livelihoods, and some habitat. Restaurant attention can exaggerate status, though it may also preserve regional names and reward growers who work carefully. The delicacy was constructed, but it was not invented from nothing. The animal remains biologically ordinary. What is no longer cheap is the system that puts it safely and reliably in front of a distant diner. Restoration projects make the missing mechanism unusually clear. In several regions, groups gather old oyster shells from restaurants and other sources, then clean or cure them and return suitable shell material to the water. Hatcheries produce larvae or young oysters for placement on prepared surfaces.
Sanctuary reefs protect breeding populations. Monitoring teams measure survival, settlement, reef growth, disease, and water conditions. Shell is essential because restoration takes more than releasing additional animals. Young oysters need a surface to grip. A bare bottom, or one covered in sediment, may offer nothing suitable. Restoring the reef's height can raise oysters into moving water and create the layered surfaces another generation will need. Oysters must rebuild the infrastructure that makes more oysters possible. The results are always local. Water quality, salinity, temperature, disease, sediment, harvest rules, and continued maintenance shape what happens. Success in one tributary cannot promise success along an entire coast. Historical abundance cannot be summoned on demand once the physical reef is gone either. Those original structures took generations to accumulate. Even so, restoration brings the whole chronology into focus. Indigenous communities harvested productive coastal systems over long periods. Colonists and early Americans encountered regionally extensive beds and made oysters an ordinary food. Urban markets carried them into cellars, saloons, and street stalls. Thomas Downing proved that a broad supply could sustain both affordable meals and distinguished dining. Packing houses, cans, ice, steam, and rail carried oysters across the country. Dredges and mass markets increased extraction. Sewage and industrial pollution degraded urban waters. Disease deepened the decline in regions already under stress. Regulation made the trade safer and more controlled. Aquaculture rebuilt commercial supply, while restaurants turned provenance, perishability, and individual service into prestige. That order matters. Oysters were not cheap because earlier Americans had poor taste. They were cheap because living reefs and immense regional fisheries produced enough to sustain many different kinds of eating. Nor did they become expensive because modern diners suddenly recognized quality. They became comparatively scarce after extraction and pollution weakened the systems behind their abundance. Farmers can raise more oysters. Restoration crews can put shell back into the water. Communities can improve habitat and protect breeding reefs. Producing individual oysters is still easier than reconstructing the old ecological engine beneath them. A market crop can grow within years. A complex reef, woven into an estuary and renewed across generations, takes much longer to accumulate. That is the hidden cost within modern oyster luxury. The price pays for more than rarity and restaurant ceremony. It reflects the move from self-renewing abundance to managed supply. Oysters that once arrived by the basket are now counted, sorted, traced, refrigerated, and presented one shell at a time. Look again at the oyster resting on raw bar ice. It fits in one hand. Someone has scrubbed its shell and opened its hinge with a practiced knife. Its growing place may be printed beside it. For an animal eaten in a single mouthful, it occupies a surprising amount of room on the menu. Behind that shell was once a much larger physical world. Reefs assembled by generations of oysters, shallow beds worked with hand tongs, boats unloading at waterfront markets, baskets passing through crowded streets, cellar kitchens making stews, and stalls feeding people who were celebrating nothing grander than the end of a workday. A larger human system stood behind it too. Coastal knowledge guided the harvest. Entrepreneurs such as Thomas Downing turned abundance into opportunity and prestige. Shuckers and packers made national distribution possible. Railroads and canneries carried oysters inland. Dredges sped up extraction. Cities grew beside the estuaries and returned their waste to the same water. When polluted oysters turned a popular raw food into a vehicle for illness, public health authorities intervened. Growers, regulators, hatcheries, and restoration groups inherited what was left. The oyster never chose luxury. Americans changed its water. They changed the speed at which oysters could be removed, the distance they could travel, the places where they could be sold, and the dining rooms that kept serving them after the old abundance vanished. That does not turn every modern raw bar into a monument to ecological loss. Many oysters now come from farms, and careful cultivation can support coastal economies while adding hard structure to local waters. Historical beds did not all decline for the same reason. An expensive plate does not always represent a depleted wild fishery. The lesson is narrower and more useful. Abundance is not an empty ocean waiting for people to harvest it. With oysters, abundance had a physical form. Living animals built its shell upon shell inside functioning estuaries. It renewed itself only while enough structure, clean water, and breeding oysters remained. Damage those foundations and both price and culture change. The next time you see one oyster lying on ice, the most revealing detail may be everything missing from the scene. You cannot see the old reef. The market baskets, cellar counters, and street stalls have disappeared too. A history built around multitudes has been reduced to the presentation of one perfect shell. Oysters built reefs. Human communities made them food. Cities turned them into merchandise. Industry carried them nationwide. Extraction and pollution made them scarce. Regulation made them safer and more controlled. Restaurants gave that controlled scarcity the shape of luxury. The animal remained recognizably the same. Its ecosystem, supply chain, and social setting did not. Every attempt to restore an oyster ground returns to the same quiet principle that once made a cheap street meal possible. Before anyone can consume abundance, something must build it. If this history changed how you see oysters, subscribe to The Hidden Course and share the part of the story that surprised you most.